let's start from the beginning for the recording purposes. That's the plan of our lecture today, tomorrow, and partially on Friday. The idea is to develop all the themes that we have included in the program, which is available in our website, in the internet, and to move from there. The plan for Module 2, which is the one that we are starting now, is to take a closer look about the MDGs, SDGs process. As we said before, the Millennium Declaration in the year 2000 started a new process that was part of something that started with the decades for the poverty eradication established by United Nations. Now we are going through the second decade, but this is a very complex and interesting process at the international level, where poverty was the center of the preoccupations of development specialists, practitioners, and scholars as well. United Nations recognize somehow this preoccupation at the world level and declare the first decade for poverty eradication. In this way, the notion of development was very much concentrated on poverty and poverty eradication. I highlight the concept of eradication because it's a very strong one, and successive initiatives like the MDGs and SDGs had as target number one poverty eradication and poverty reduction, depending on the definition of poverty they adopted. As we said previously, there are many definitions of poverty, and both the SDGs and the previous initiative, the MDGs, adopted one definition of poverty based on income. It is an arbitrary definition, it's a normative one. We are quite critical of that, as we said before. However, this is what was decided by the General Assembly of the United Nations, and this is what is inspiring the search for sustainable development, as well as the search for eradication of extreme poverty. However, we will see that the SDGs initiative adopts two kinds of definitions, and the fight against poverty will focus on both definitions of poverty. This is something that we will see through this module. You have all the themes there, and this is the rest of the module we will work in. Today, in our first lecture, what we are going to do is try to relate the notion of sustainable development with some of the main variables, independent variables, that explain the movements of the sustainable development variable. And this is something that I am very eager to do, because we are working within the approach of sustainability science, and we desperately need to look for causes for development, as well for causes for poverty, hunger, good or bad health, those variables which movement explain the movement in the variable development. This is a very simple, I would say simplistic way of looking at development, but since you are all graduate students working with several theories, it is important for you to be conscious about what are the causes of the problem we are trying to address. Please remember, in previous classes, focus on TDR, transdisciplinary research and sustainability science approach. We said that the concentration of the problem is a must. We need to identify what the problems are and begin our research from there on. But once we identify the problem, being the problem either development or its dialectical counterpart poverty, we need to know, or at least we need to theoretically try to know what are the causes that explain this phenomenon we want to address. And to do that, we need theories or hypotheses. And hypotheses and theories, what they do basically is relate a set of independent variables with what we are trying to explain, which in this case is development, and a particular kind of development which is called sustainable development. As we previously said, the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals and Targets present a theory about what are the causes of development to be realized or not. And the causes are stated in the 17 goals and 169 targets that were approved by the United Nations General Assembly. Even though there is no general theory that links all of them with sustainable development, in our simplistic approach to this issue, we can say basically that sustainable development is a function of the eradication of poverty according to target 1.1, or the reduction of poverty that is defined in a different way in point or target 1.2. As you may see there, the SDGs work clearly with two definitions of poverty. One, which is the more simple one, the one that you know, which is directly related to income, is now fixed in $1.9 US per capita as the line that measure what's extreme poverty. Those that falls below that line are extreme poor. Those that are a little bit above are not considered extreme poor, although of course they still are poor. But it's important here that you are also aware of the different kind of definition of poverty that is included in point 1.2, which is a target that need to be also reached by 2030. And those definitions vary according to the national standards that each country has. We will get into the details when the presentation of Professor Oliver Mitapuri arrives. But I just want to be aware the different targets that are part of the SDGs. When we say poverty, we are referring to goal number 1 and all its targets. When I said hunger, I consider as an independent variable to explain development, I'm referring to SDG number 2 and its own target. And in this way, we can go until the end, until SDG number 17. Well, then we will address particularly some of the goals and targets of climate change. This is something that Professor Noel Kinlassdale and his team will work on. But now it's about time that we start dealing with the basic definition of development that we will have in mind, or at least my lecture is inspired in, and also to be aware that we should put this into a broader context. I want you to know what are the main theories or approaches to development that I am working on, just very, very roughly, very, very broadly, because I adopt a critical approach to development. I also need you to know some of the basic debates about development that have been going on for quite a while in development studies. Then we will present what I consider a relevant theory of the production of poverty that also can explain development under development, which is called the political economy of poverty and development. This is something we shall do before the end of this module. So those are basically two critical perspectives on development that understand development as an historical process. AC it means me. I am Alberto, so that's why I put it there, just not to forget that I had my own definition there. But Rist, who is a critical scholar in development studies, he defined development as a set of practice, sometimes in conflict each other. And this is something that you need to be aware of. Development and conflict go along most of the time. In many cases, conflict is one instrument of development in many historical cases, but this set of practice are set into a context that we call the historical context. That's why I approached to development as a historical process of social transformation. I generally agree with Rist in the sense that development is a process of social change and transformation, and this process could be a negative or a positive process. Not always development drive us to the point where we want, or to our desired objective, or something that is good for society. It could really drive us to some places where we wouldn't like to stay, like the place we are in right now, where the environment is suffering some of the consequences of the model of development that has been implemented for the past century or so. And this is important to be aware, because when we are discussing the module on climate change, we definitely will address this. In the previous presentation by Professor Kim Lazaire, we saw how CO2 emissions were affecting some of the gases that we have in the atmosphere, particularly vapor, and the conjunction of and the interaction of both vapor and CO2 were producing global warming. And this is something we need to be conscious. It is a result of a historical process that was focused in certain model of production, and it's also related to the consumption. Some of the independent variables that are included in SDGs, and we saw yesterday that are going to condition the entire process for sustainable development to be realized. So, if we agree that development is a historical process that concentrates in the process of production, consumption, and distribution, we will see why the sustainable development definition made by the SDGs agree in this, and focus as well in the need to change the patterns of consumption and production. This is a huge task, because at the end means that we have to change our model of development as we know today. We have to change not only the model of development, but also the ways that society see those models and act upon. And naturally, in order to solve some of the main problems we include here in this model as independent variables, we will need definitely to address the question of distribution of public and private resources, goods and services. This is something that we shall discuss later on, when I will ask you for your own definitions about development, your own definitions about poverty, and your own definitions about the relationship between sustainable development and poverty, which is the subject matter of the module number 2. And I ask you as students, graduate students, persons that are conducting research, that start thinking in causal terms. You have to start thinking in causal terms if you want to develop a research agenda following an approach of sustainability science, typical in sustainability science, on transdisciplinary research. Why? Because as we saw yesterday, it is imperative that when we work with TDR or sustainability science approach, we identify the problem and also visualize the solution. And how can we do that without a knowledge about the causes that are producing development or some ways of underdevelopment based on the existence of poverty and hunger. So it is important. But it's also important you be aware that now, when we are dealing with Model 2, we mainly address poverty not as an independent variable, as it is here, but also we will see poverty as a dependent variable, which is function of a number of independent variables. Those are going to be the causes. And I want you to tell me, not necessarily in this lecture, but later on, what are the causes, the independent variables of your research? And this is a question that is directly addressed to those of you who are researching, conducting research or doing your PhD thesis on poverty, on poverty-related issues. Because you must have an explanatory model or an interpretation about why poverty is produced in the context you are conducting research. And again, this is a very simple, or if you want to, simplistic way to address this. I know that reality is extremely complex, and the realities of poverty are even more complex. It involves hundreds of variables that keep moving all the time. But at some point, we as researchers need to stop that film, that moving picture, and decide what is more important to address. What are the variables that are crucial to understand how poverty is produced and reproduced in a certain historical context. And once we identify that context, we will be able to address it, because poverty as development are social constructions. And we do need to know how poverty and development are constructed in different historical contexts. And once we know that, we can operate over that. And again, remember that in transdisciplinary research and in a sustainability science approach, we do need to link science with action. We do need to find solutions to societal problems, to important societal problems that in the jargon of our approach are called global challenges. How are we doing so far? Okay, Anastasia, you are in charge of the timing, so when 10 minutes are left, you know what to do, 10. And when 5 minutes are left, you tell me 5. And we need to do that in order to arrive on time for Oliver's lecture. So, tomorrow we will start with your research, and on Friday we will concentrate definitely on the independent variables that explain this. So I will go and ask you what are the independent variables that explain the changes of our dependent variable, poverty. And I will do that because one of the latest, it was a 2007, if I recall it right, article by Dasgupta and Cates. Cates is one of the founder fathers of the sustainability science approach. They address the issue of poverty in Africa. I can see that many colleagues that are from Africa, but Asia, Latin America can be places where poverty has a structural stand in those societies. And the question is clearly, what are the causes of that persisting poverty? What are the causes of such a structural problem in our societies? And they did a quite interesting analysis of some of the articles presented to a special number, and they found that the search for independent variables were multiple, as we can easily imagine. In any case, I didn't want to bring that. I didn't want to include that in your readings because I want you to think hard about the hypotheses you think are relevant to explain poverty. And in order to think hard about hypotheses, you have to have independent variables that explain the movement of the dependent variable. Otherwise, you can hardly have a clear hypothesis. And this is something that you need to do based in the context of your research. Because as we said before, poverty and development are historical processes, are historical social constructions. So you are in the best position, since you have been studying these issues for quite a while, to determine what are the most important variables that will explain the movement in this dependent variable. And this is something that you should be able to do by the end of this course. Okay. Questions, doubts, answers? I do not have time to get into the details of the evolution of the notion of development in Western and Eastern societies. But the idea that basically inspired the development, as it was taken mostly in Western society, is also inspired in the Western imaginary, and the idea of growth and progress that is intrinsic to that imaginary. And we need to be conscious about that. And this is why the reaction against development that was brought by post-developmentalist literature was so hard on this imaginary. I just want you to be aware of that because in some regions, more than others, this discussion adopt a quite critical stand, particularly in the region where I come from. Some of the scholars that inspired both the literature of development or dependency theory and post-developmentalists were in Latin America, where I'm coming from. And then we can discuss that more in detail. Because some of the independent variables that explain the movement of our dependent variable are there in that literature, depending on the author you find, you will find different variances of the independent variables. I will not get into those independent variables now because I want you to have a fresh look to the hypothesis you are going to work on. And this is something that needs to be inspired in your knowledge and your creativity and your contextualization of the phenomena we are trying to explain. This is crucial at this stage of our course. So the idea of growth and progress as linear process is right there. And this is something that has incredibly affected the idea of development and the practice of development. because we define development as a practice. And is that so to the extent that development has mostly be understood as economic growth. And even today, if you talk to many practitioners, politicians, many persons try to identify both. Surprisingly, after all these decades of evolution in theory of development, in the practice of development, in the understanding of poverty, the multidimensionality of poverty, etc. And this is something that is also in some of the programs you may find in international organization, programs that affect the life and the existence of thousands and millions of people all over the world. So again, we don't have time to get into this. There are some critical views that concentrate in what are called the shared belief and obligatory practice. I do recommend the work of Rist. Then I will provide the details of the different literature on this if you want to. And this is something important because at some point theory and the set of beliefs that we can define as ideology gets into development, and we have different ideologies about development, and at some point it's very important to distinguish between theories, empirical findings, and ideologies, and all of them are mixed in the idea of development and naturally in the ways poverty and poverty reduction or eradication are faced. So, at some point in the 70s, I would say the late 60s in Latin America clearly, there was a strong criticism about the notion of development that we have been touching upon, just on the surface. And several critical theories and criticism about the idea of development, about the causes of poverty and inequality, race in all continents, in Africa as well, the creation of some of the schools of thought, like the well-known dependency theory in its different variances. They have several, address very, very critically the notion and the practice of development that have been implemented worldwide. And we arrive in this way to what I call the post-critic or criticism that has among its salient promoters Escobar, that developed this line of thought. I would say in a time where development and development practices and theories didn't show the results we were expecting at that point. And this coincides with the rebirth of the problematic of poverty to the extent that was captured by United Nations in the first decade for development. So the 70s, 80s and 90s is a period where the post-critique was addressing some of the problems, but also look into its own intellectual production. I like you to see also that this post-critique that address mainly the notions behind development that were inspired in the Western imaginary, and the idea of a linear process was I would say successfully addressed by the post-development theory and the feminists particularly, and other kind of critical approaches. However, post-criticism has had its own problems. And those problems were, I'd say, briefly and successfully presented by one of the fathers of the post-developmentalists, and you may find right there on the screen. It was an excessive focus on discourse. Most of this school focused directly right there. I still think this is extremely important because discourse is the way we have as human to present reality. And the idea of development and the idea of the causes of poverty are very much linked to the way we present this. And I will concentrate particularly when I address critically the MDGs, SDGs process on discourse, because I truly think that this is important. However, the need to focus on discourse need to also be aware that poverty and the real problems of our mode of productions are right there. We cannot ignore that capitalism, not capitalism as a whole, but certain form of capitalism are prone to produce poverty and to reproduce poverty. We can ignore that. Most of us know very well how capitalism in the South produce a lot of wealth, but also produce a lot of poverty, reproduce poverty and inequality to a scale that now need to be approached globally. And this is something that we also need to be aware. But we also need to be aware that there are certain forms of capitalism that are more gentle with poverty and inequality. And you all are now in Norway, and I strongly recommend you to look around and to ask yourself why Norway, that was one of the most, or one of the poorest countries in Europe not so long ago, became a very developed country. And this is a very good question because, as we said previously, development and poverty are historical process that have historical explanation. And this is something that we need to work carefully on, and we also need to contextualize because perhaps it's not possible to reproduce the historical process of development of Norway in the south. But nevertheless, we can extract some important lessons that we can rethink in terms of our own context. And I think that is very important because we have addressed somehow this issue about social movement and traditions, and I will readdress this when I deal with the political economy of poverty and development, because in many parts of the world, social movements have been an incredibly important force to push for new models of development, for new forms of the organization of the society and the state, and we need again to contextualize this. We will address the specific cases where social movements were relevant, and we also need to put those social movements in the context of your own realities, which I suspect are very different in the case of the African nations that are represented by you, or in the case of India or Bangladesh or other countries that are also represented by the students here. In order to do that, I will use some of the intellectual production we have at CROP, and we will get into some specific cases of that are being a research that have been conducted under the umbrella of the political economy of poverty. So, questions, doubts, answers, criticism. Do we have any? Okay. So, again. You decided, I guess, quite freely, to take a course called Agenda 2030, where climate change and poverty were the subject matter of this course, but we decided to link them to the sustainability science approach. As you already know, sustainability science approach is a post-normal kind of scientific approach. I rather call it a scientific endeavor that are walking on the borders of mainstream science, willing to move beyond that limit, because we have a need. And the need is to deal properly with these variables. So if we want to achieve sustainable development, we know that poverty needs to be reduced, need to go this way. If we want to achieve sustainable development, we know that hunger needs to be eradicated. If we want to achieve that, we know that health needs to be increased. And in this way, each of the variables that are included in the SDGs need to properly move in the variable in the sense positive or negative that we want to. Otherwise, it will not be achievable. However, you will have to, if you want to move in this fashion, to adapt your own research in a way that sustainability is part of that research. And for this reason, you will have to accommodate the variables in your own research. So now you have two homeworks. One, to think hard about the independent variables that explain the changes in this variable, but you need to be aware that you are working in just one of the dimensions of the idea of sustainable development. However, as long as you work in one of these dimensions, it could be poverty, hunger, health, whatever, you transform your independent variable into a dependent variable. And you, one of the assignments, again, is to look for convincing independent variables that will explain the movement of your dependent variable in your historical context. And I stress the word convincing because I like very much the definition of good methodology that I've been working very much for the past 3 decades. And to put it simple, a good methodology is that could convince the skeptics, being the skeptics the member of the scientific community, about the reasons you decide to select that variable to explain the movements of the other. You also need to be fully aware, as I said many times, and I will repeat many times, that this is just a strategy to address complexity. It's one of the multiple strategies that you may find. After 30 plus years of dealing with research design and students, both at MA and PhD level, I find this strategy very useful to deal with the sense of frustration that we as social scientists have and face in our career. And the sense of frustration has to do, of course, with the realities of the subject matter we are studying, but also it is very much related to the fact that sometimes we just don't know how to face research design to manage in order to manage that complexity. And this is something that perhaps most of you experienced. This is something that most of you are dealing currently with, because you have hundreds of variables moving all the time. And when you start trying to know how those variables move, they keep moving, and generating a lot of confusion. This will not explain the reality you are trying to explain in full. However, it will get you started, and it will help you to have an interpretation, an explanation of the theme or the topic you are working with. And to start with a plan is something very important, not only for research, but also for action. And I think that you as researchers or activists or politicians or decision makers need to have an idea about how things work. And fortunately, we have in science theories that can help us to do that job. But many of those theories are not well developed. They are not even consistent. And that's explained why practice, as Rist mentioned in his definition, are sometimes contradictory. Because in the real world, different definitions of development, different notions about what brings development up, about how the system work, interact in a contradictory way. And this is something that we as scientists, fortunately, have the possibility to see clearly if we have a clear understanding of what we want to explain or understand. If not, it will be very difficult. So, according to Anastasia, our timekeeper, I should stop right here. So let's continue with the following lecture after the tea break, where Professor Oliver Tapuri will enlighten us with different definitions of poverty, and we will try to put them in the context of sustainability science. Please remember that one of the characteristics or constitutive elements of sustainability science is normativity. In sustainability science, we explicitly acknowledge the normativity that is present many times inadvertently in social science. And we shall identify very clearly how normativity is used in the different definitions of poverty in order to contextualize it and to provide a more clear understanding, this time, of our dependent variable. So Oliver will work on the dependent variable. You keep thinking about independent variables, and let's see what happened at the end of the process. Thank you very much.